With WetheP, today with Mary Pipher, an amazing community organizer and author who's done incredible work nationwide in a number of sectors. Hi Mary, thank you so much for joining us. So you are an expert, you are one of the elder stateswomen of civic engagement and community organizing. Tell me when this sort of started for you. Was it in the 60s?
Yeah. Well, first of all, like many people in my generation in the 60s, I was deeply engaged in so many causes, really flowered in that era. I was engaged in the civil rights movement. In Kansas City in 1965 when I went to college, they were starting to have sit-ins in the lunch counters of Kansas City to desegregate lunch counters in diners. And I was part of that. I was part of the first civil rights marches that I know of in Kansas City. There may have been some decades earlier. And then I ended up at Berkeley. And of course, Berkeley was civil rights, gay rights, women's rights, environmental rights, free speech rights, anti-war movement. So I just really had a lot of opportunity to work with other people around causes that meant a great deal to me, and to learn a few things about organizing. Although, to be honest, one of the things I learned about organizing in the 60s was men do the organizing. And the women tended, for the most part, unless it was women's groups, and I actually was a little pre-women's group consciousness emerging. The men were in charge, and the women, for the most part, made spaghetti and got things kind of organized. And that's one thing I remember thinking is like, we're all equal, but the men are the ones who generally are in charge of the organizing. But of course I learned it, even though I wasn't usually in charge.
So and you continued doing community organizing even when it wasn't as sexy and as exciting as the 60s, with some of your work, including some of your work around reviving Ophelia, the book many know of you for. What has changed over those years? What's the same? What was changed from your work and from others' work during the 60s, and what needs to be changed?
Well, you know, like many people, Andrea, I took a break when I was getting my PhD, when I was establishing a therapy practice and working at the university and raising my own children. And it's not that I did nothing, but I wasn't particularly active as an organizer until my children were grown. And then I wanted to write Reviving Ophelia. At the time, I didn't see it as community organizing. I saw it as a therapist is writing a book about what she is experiencing working with teenage girls in a toxic culture. And first of all, I didn't expect anybody to buy the book. I just felt the need to write it because I had these thoughts. But secondly, I didn't realize that if people bought this book, if a great number of people bought this book, I would actually end up being a community organizer. Because what happened after that book is, of course, it did very well, but I got so many opportunities to visit all over the world, not just in America, a lot in America, but I went to South Africa, I went to Poland, I went to Okinawa in Japan, and all over the world to work with people who were interested in that book.
Girls. Why?
I know.
Why did it matter at that time, which was what, early 80s, late 70s? I mean, this was
Well, first of all, why it mattered to me was I had a teenage daughter. And every book I've written came deeply from my own heart and passion. In other words, I've never been a writer who goes, well, what kind of book would sell right now? Or what do I have expertise in? In fact, what I like to do is explore a question I have no expertise in. And put together all the good information I can find in a way that is creative and explains the situation to me in a better way than it was being explained by the culture before I started the project.
This is a Betty Friedan model in a way.
Is it? It may be. It's very similar to what Betty Friedan did when she was experiencing something.
That's a hunch.
Yeah, and she's experiencing something the thing I was experiencing was the ways my daughter was suffering, the ways I was failing as a parent, could not be explained by the cultural scripts. In fact, the cultural scripts, were we, my daughter and I, to believe them, would only have made us suffer more and feel even worse about our situation.
Absolutely.
So I also realized those scripts aren't true. They don't actually reflect what I'm seeing in therapy. For example, at that time the main script was if you have a teenager who's not happy, it's because it's a dysfunctional family. Well, one thing about our family, I mean, I wouldn't claim we were a totally functional family. Of course, that'd be to open myself up for cynical glances from everyone. Right, but we got along all right, and my daughter wasn't unhappy when she left for school in the morning. She was unhappy when she came home from school because of what was happening at school.
Interesting.
And so I realized, well, it's not all about our family. She goes to school and gets depressed. Well, she was getting bullied, of course. And so a lot of her despair, that of course was externalized in our family as anger and sulkiness and
because
all that,
it's safer to express it.
was really related to school and the way she was treated as a somewhat chubby, smart girl, shy girl.
So she broke the norms by being smart, and maybe not.
She just
totally
wasn't.
fitting those models.
She just wasn't. As she said, every boy in my school wants to date the same 5 anorexic girls. She just wasn't a real pretty girl with the right designer clothes. That's all it took to be bullied.
And this touched a nerve. You weren't the only family struggling with this, clearly. You weren't the only mother or the only person that was noticing there's an issue, because your book did touch a nerve.
Right. Well, and from that idea, actually I'd written one book before, Reviving WetheP, called Hunger Pains. And that was my attempt to explain what I thought was going on with eating disorders. Because before my book, the only thing out there was Freudians talking about it. And when I read what the Freudians had to say, I thought it was nuts. I just thought, this is some kind of a fantasy
Here
idea.
I'm a woman and it's not fitting.
It's so not true. It's so not like anything I'm experiencing. But there was no literature. So I just wrote a little book on this, which was later published after Reviving. Before that, just self-published. But what I started to realize was writing is as good a vehicle for activism as there is. Because if you really think clearly through a problem and present the problem, present your thinking, and then present the implications of your thinking with some ideas for action, people all over the world can take your cultural product and use it in their specific time and place to create good on earth. So that's when I decided I'm going to be a writer activist. And I've now finished my 9th book. And most of those books, I was not a community organizer, except I wrote these books, and then I'd go around and talk about what I knew and what I learned and help mobilize and energize communities to self-organize. Now this last book, though, The Green Bow, is a little bit different because I realized at the same time I wanted to write as a psychologist about why aren't we dealing with this extraordinarily...
What our colleague calls a citizen professional, excuse me, I want to put that out there. A psychologist that's writing as a citizen as well.
Absolutely, that's a nice citizen professional. No, I've never heard that phrase, great phrase. Anyway, what I really wanted to do was on one hand explore this issue as a professional, on the other hand work on this issue as a citizen. That's a good phrase for this, what I want to do. And so I actually got organized a group, started a group, and our little group decided our cause would be to stop the Keystone XL pipeline coming through our state. And we actually have thus far succeeded. We've been working 5 years on that.
And you have, one of the things I want to touch on, is you've used some new methods. You might call them new, I suppose nothing's terribly new, and yet you're using, instead of the battle the protest all the time, you're also using some warmth and some humor and some good natured attempts at agitating positive outcomes. Am I right?
Yeah, I mean, we never do anything in anger. We never do anything, in quotes, radical. You know, Nebraska is a very polite state, and the word radical is a very negative word in our state. So we do very polite Nebraska-style things.
Like, does polite work? This is the question. You know
Well,
what I'm
it's
saying?
worked
I
for
mean,
us.
I
It's
agree
worked
with
for
you,
us
and
for
yet
5
you know,
years.
you can hear the skeptics going, but you know, and as a psychologist, you are most appropriate to ask. So in a lot of my research, I've looked at the psychology of reactivity, and we can react by passion, either positive or negative. And what our culture seems to prefer in media anyway is the negative passion, the anger.
Well, the
How does it
media,
work counter?
the media doesn't necessarily cover polite events, although one of the things we've figured out is really creative ways to get media attention. Like, for example, we have the apple pie brigade that's always presenting fresh-baked, savory apple pies.
That's not fair.
To good citizens. And
No,
sometimes,
it's wonderful.
like we presented apple pie to this one representative we had in Congress who didn't believe in climate change, in the hopes that this pie would encourage him to look into the science of climate change. So we'll very politely give him an apple pie with a stated goal for that apple pie. We've done things like wildflower bouquets delivered to all the senators' offices.
Beautiful.
But you know what? We ended up getting a meeting with our governor that we can't say cause and effect. You never know the real cause-effect relationships. But we went in, here's what we've been doing. We've been, every Monday at noon, women met at the governor's mansion with a wildflower bouquet or some cinnamon rolls or muffins or whatever. And we all wrote him thank you in advance messages. Thank you in advance, Governor, for looking into this Trans-Canada pipeline and how it'll affect our land and water. Thank you in advance for calling a special session of our legislature to make sure our senators, we had not a law on the book governing oil pipelines in our state. We want some laws governing those. Thank you in advance. Well, the governor, of course, never received these gifts from us. He never met with us. His security guard just came and picked him up. He never answered us. But after every time we delivered this to his mansion, we'd go to his office. He's never in sight, but we'd ask his executive secretary or assistant, could we schedule a meeting with the governor? The governor never said yes. He'd always delay us. Well, finally, one day, a neighbor of mine who worked for the governor was walking through the office, and I grabbed this guy. We actually weren't that close of friends, but I just, for the moment, to confuse him, I kind of grab him, and I go, Larry, it's great to see you. How's your daughter doing? How's your wife doing? Well, he's a polite Nebraskan.
And your neighbor.
And I'm a neighbor. He could not really refuse to stop it. So then I introduce him to our group, and I go, Larry, we're really having a hard time getting together with the governor.